My wife and I, a couple days ago, started talking about something we thought would be pretty interesting. So we stopped ourselves kind of mid conversation or relatively early on and decided we'd sit down and talk about it now. So the conversation started off with us talking a bit about taxes since we're kind of coming up on tax season
Oh, favorite time of year.
for everyone,
It's
I'm
the
sure.
most wonderful
Yeah.
time of the year.
And our bonuses had come in recently, and so obviously you get to see pretty straightforward what what your effective tax rate is, relatively easy to calculate. And we were looking at that and comparing it to the relative inflation, particularly in the U.S. And you commented something along the lines of never previously being able to clearly observe inflation.
Okay. Yeah, I remember making that comment.
Yeah, so we've talked about this on many occurrences, and it came up when we were discussing inflation here. To the point where when we were having our discussion, I asked, "This is the thing that annoys me most," and you knew exactly what I was talking about when I said the thing that annoys me most, because there's only one thing that annoys me most. I'm wildly consistent in this thing, and
There are plenty of things that annoy you.
yeah, there are
I
plenty of
mean,
things that annoy me,
but
like everyone. But this one, I have deemed the most annoying thing to me every single time,
yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
and I have not wavered on this for years now.
Yeah. So, okay, so I made a comment about inflation because, and I'm not that old, but part of this might be that I wasn't paying as much attention before, and now I'm older, so I am paying more
Sure.
attention. But yeah, I think the comment I made was like right now I feel like I can tangibly see the effects of inflation
Like in
un-
real time.
unlike I've ever been able to. Like, we keep close tabs on what we spend at Costco and at the grocery stores, and I know like
Yeah, we have a grocery
these
tracker.
frozen strawberries that used to cost $9.99 cost $10.49 now, and
Or certain chips.
the
What were those?
chips used to be $3.99. They're
Now they're
four
four
four.
ninety.
No, they're $4.49 now.
And this is what, a year and a half apart,
Not
if even
even,
that.
not even. No, I'm saying like we could look back 6 months, and I those chips cost $3.99. And
Yeah.
I remember the specific shopping trip at Costco where we were going down the snack aisle, and I was looking at the price tag like, what happened? This used to be $3.99. These are so cheap. I mean, they're still cheap at $4.49, but I saw like in front of my own eyes, 50-cent increase right there.
Yeah.
And it's not just the chips. I mean, so many things.
So I think the big highlight here is that it's not as though one item is clearly increasing in price. And it's not as though the increase is unsubstantial on a percentage basis. So when we have an increase of 50 cents on something that is now $5 essentially, that's a large price increase. Right? We're not talking
Yeah.
about 5 or 10 cents, and we're not talking about how
Well, that's a
I've
10%.
observed inflation previously, which
Yeah.
is it's a slow rollout where you find out 4 years later that your grocery bill is 5-6% higher
Yeah.
because things increase 10 cents here,
Yeah.
10 cents there pretty
Yeah, no,
slowly
no.
over
This
time.
there was a distinct like one shopping trip. These chips were $3.99, and the next shopping trip they were $4.49.
Yeah.
I remember, and maybe that's part of like Costco policy. Like they did mass price increases across the board. Starting effective this date or whatever.
Well, it also
But
wasn't just Costco.
no, not just Costco. I mean other places where we buy food. I think like the protein powder that we buy at Whole Foods. I know that went up.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think. There was something else that I was buying recently.
There are
that-
gas prices too.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff going into the gas prices.
Yeah,
thing,
that's true.
But
Fair.
but I there was something else. I can't remember. Something not grocery related. That yeah, it was like this got more expensive. I can tell.
Yeah. And so we were talking previously about kind of comparing the rate of inflation, which, I think you can observe on whatever the government is reporting, right? And that differs from person to person, right? So, for instance, if you're looking at your mortgage, right, you're not seeing, on at least the majority of that, you're not seeing a radical increase in terms of what you're paying on your mortgage. So, if 25% of your take home pay was being spent on your mortgage, well, that wasn't necessarily affected by inflation. But
Okay.
if food goes up 10% or 5%, right, you have to apply it to whatever portion of your take home pay that constitutes. So we were just kind of eyeballing certain numbers relative to the percentage of our take home pay that's being spent on that, whether that be groceries or gas or health and beauty items or whatever. And we were coming to the conclusion that what we got as merit increases or bonuses just kind of, it was very close to what inflation was, which is uncommon, especially for people near our age, as we're relatively speaking early on in our careers. And I want to be clear, I don't think that we are unique in this observation. We've spoken with friends and family, and they've seen similar things, and you can see similar reports in the news, I think, right? I think there's statistical evidence as well as anecdotal evidence to back this up.
That people are seeing the effects of the current inflation.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And when I turned to you earlier and I said, what's the thing that annoys me most? I feel like this is a perfect example of this. Okay. And like I said earlier, this thing that annoys me most does not change. I'm consistent in the thing that annoys me most. The thing that annoys me most is when I suffer the consequences of somebody else's poor choice. And I want to stress that. Somebody else's poor choice. There are plenty of things where something happens to somebody else or something happens to me. And it just happens. Things occur in the world, tragedy strikes, you have a grandparent and they come down with some illness, or something happens with them and they need to move homes, right? And now you have to go and help. I don't take any issue with that. Okay? Now I feel bad for that grandparent or the person who needs that help, but I don't get annoyed with having to help because things happen. Things will happen to me, and I want to be there to help people when they need it, and I'd like people, hopefully, to be able to help me when I need it. So I don't necessarily take an issue with when something negative happens to somebody else and it's totally outside of their control, or even mostly outside of their control, and then I have to help out, or it negatively affects me in some way. Similarly, if something just happens to me, right? Like, for instance, if something just happens to break around me, okay? Things break every so often. You can't prevent every single thing like that from occurring. So I don't have a massive issue with that. What I do take issue with is when somebody else makes a poor decision and I suffer the negative consequences of that. So, for instance, in the case of inflation, I think a relatively watertight argument can be made that many of the policy decisions that have been made, whether that's from the Fed or from the government sending out a bunch of stimulus checks and spending large amounts of money, in either case, these are things that are outside of my control. And yet, at the end of the day, I'm severely negatively affected from an effective earning side of things.
Yeah, I think the qualifier to what you're saying, or how I understand it, is it's not even necessarily like someone made a mistake and made a bad decision, or didn't know what they were doing and made a bad decision, but someone was like actively being ignorant, or what's the word?
Irresponsible?
Ignorant or irresponsible, or there's another word I'm thinking about. And of course, now that I'm trying to think of it, it's, my brain is completely locking it out of my known vocabulary. It's not so much that someone just made a bad decision or a poor decision because they didn't know, they hadn't learned about that, or they made a mistake about something. It was It's more so when someone's being actively ignorant or irresponsible about something, and you feel like you are in absolute, you have no control or power to like, no control or power over the situation.
Yeah.
So you feel like it's like you can sit here and scream into the void like, I know the effects of you doing this. Like, don't do this. I know exactly what's going to happen. And the person like just is absolutely oblivious to that. Oblivious is the word I was thinking about.
Oh.
Someone's being completely oblivious to something, and you can see, like, you can put all the pieces together and see those 10 steps ahead, and you're just watching it all play out and waiting for the bad thing to like trickle down to you, because you already saw that this is going to happen.
It's like watching a train wreck just right in front of you that you can't do anything
about it. Right? Like if I accidentally, like, you know, pulled the car out of the garage and smashed the mirror, and now you are going to be late to work because you have to go get it in. Like, yeah, that would probably annoy you, but I don't know that that falls into the category of like thing that annoys you the most, because it's something that I did on accident versus
So
if you had repeatedly time and time again told me, hey, you can't be parking the car in the garage this way. Every time you nearly clip it. And you repeatedly tell me, and I'm just being ignorant to that, and I don't listen, and you can see all the pieces of what's going to happen.
Yeah.
But, like, I just still do it, and then this happens, and you're like, great, now this is affecting me, and I knew this was going to happen.
Yeah. I think maybe the other qualifier that I would have is there's most definitely leniency given to like children, let's say, right? Because children don't understand a lot of the time. You could explain something and it's just not going to fully process, or they're not going to totally remember it every single time, especially when it's something like breaking something or things like that. Things just happen with kids. To your point, yeah, when you're dealing with an adult though, and you have no control, but you can see exactly where the train is headed, and
they're making some stupid decision that you're just waiting for it to come back and the ripple effect to hit you, and you know it's going to.
Yeah. So similarly, and I'm sure that I know that you are particularly annoyed with me on this, and I apologize, but I'm totally fine admitting where like I'm wrong here. So I accidentally did this to you, and admittedly you did warn me about it a little while back. Do you want to talk about that?
What are you referring to? Are you referring to like when we recorded the first whatever podcast episode? Okay. Yeah, well, we were recording one of the, you know, earlier episodes, and there's a learning curve, obviously. You know, we haven't done this before, so like we're kind of learning and figuring out as we go, and there's bumps in the road and things aren't perfect. Probably never will be, but yeah, one of the episodes we were recording, and I think you had like a loose kind of outline of what you wanted to talk about.
Yeah.
You know, it was the one with like the rules, right?
Yeah.
And numbering all of them. And I had said before we sat down, why don't you go through, make sure you have numbers written down for all of them? Because what's going to happen is we're going to stop, you're going to lose track, you're not going to know what number it is, and we have to have things like somewhat in line before we like sit down and turn on, hit record, so that it makes it easier for me later when I have to go edit this, because I'm the one, editing these things. So I had said, let's sit down, like let's write it all out, make it clear, to minimize any like editing and splicing we have to go back through. And you were like, no, it's fine. Let's just sit down, let's record, I'll go through it. Yeah. And what happened was we kept having to stop, and we, missed numbers, and numbers were wrong, and you were like, it's fine, we'll just go back, let's look through it, start editing, we'll go back later and re-record things that we need to and splice it all together. And I was like, that is not a good idea. This is going to make this so horrible for me trying to piece this all together. And I'm like, I don't really know what I'm doing here yet, right? And I could just see I'm going to have to spend so much time trying to like make this work. And guess what happened?
Exactly that.
I had to spend so much time trying to make it work.
And I can imagine how that could be infuriating. Yes.
Yeah, it was pretty infuriating.
So one of the first examples of this, for me at least, when I started realizing that this was the thing that just irked me so much, was back in the era where most people weren't using Bluetooth headphones, myself included. I had a relatively nice pair of in-ear headphones that I would use on a pretty regular basis.
Wired ones?
Yeah, wired ones. You know, the old school, nowadays, quote unquote, old school 3.5 millimeter headphone jack style. And
Phones used to have that?
yeah, and my sister had asked to borrow my headphones. And I said, that's fine. Just be like kind of careful with them because my sister, especially at the time, had a very poor track record of taking care of things, especially things of mine and my dad, since we're more careful with things, more particular. So I handed her the headphones that were kind of wrapped around one of those anti-tangle headphone wrap things. And I told her, make sure not to wrap the headphones too tightly around these. Because if you wrapped them too tightly, the cord, the copper on the inside of the cord, could become detached from the ear driver itself. And as such, your headphones would either be flaky or they wouldn't work. So I told her not to do this. And lo and behold, a couple days later, she returns them to me. And the first time I go to plug these headphones in, it starts off really statically. And as I turn my head one way or the other, it will cut out, which is exactly what happens if you over tighten or over wrap them too tightly around one of the anti-tangle headphone things. I never did get any replacement for those headphones. But anyway, that's when I realized this is the thing that just irks me to no end. It just really gets to me. Because you suffer these negative consequences for someone else's dumb actions. It's kind of like, it's almost like a double whammy. Not only are you suffering the negative consequences of somebody else's decision, which could have easily been mitigated, right? So in the case of some natural disaster coming, well, nobody could have mitigated this. Things just happen. In the case of what I'm discussing, one could simply take a few simple actions to mitigate things, and this wouldn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
And on top of this, the person who could have done this didn't. And to add insult to injury, the natural negative consequences that one should have experienced when making a dumb decision, not only are you experiencing them, but they are not experiencing them.
So is this specifically about instances where the offender actually does not experience any consequence for themselves either? Or like it doesn't affect them,
I think
but it affects other people?
it can still be annoying if it affects other people but also affects the decision maker. It's particularly insulting and infuriating when the individual who made the decision goes unaffected. So, for instance, in the case of, let's say, government officials, regardless of which side you're on, these individuals can increase or adjust their salary.
Well,
These individuals are getting money from either the salary that in some way they're in control of directly via voting for it, or they can simply start demanding higher prices for speeches or ancillary things that they do on the side.
right.
So
It's
relatively speaking, they go unaffected generally.
it's a lot easier for them to be unaffected than someone who is, typical working class citizen
Yeah.
who is your average consumer at the local supermarket or, the local department store or whatever.
Yeah.
Or, I mean, isn't it true that generally, the stock market is relatively unaffected by inflation type things because it will increase with inflation. So if you have a lot of assets in the market,
Yeah, so I would
your
say
wealth will be like less affected, right?
yeah, so I would say the short answer is yes, I believe so. There may be some form of tracking delay, but provided you're not selling, it doesn't matter much. Similarly, those who have homes, right, real estate, provided that the real estate is tracking similar to inflation, which tends to be the case, just like the market as a whole tends to track with inflation. Obviously, you can have different sectors that vary, but generally speaking, assets like those are going to track with inflation in general over time. So
Right.
I want to be clear. Like I'm not sitting here saying, "Woe is me, I have it the worst out of everyone." Right? We have investments in the market, and to some degree, we own real estate. Well, that money is going to, given enough time, track with inflation in the market. Versus something like salaries need to be individually increased. And things like food, when food prices go up on a dollar basis, wages are going to lag behind. We can immediately, like tomorrow, we
Right.
could increase the price of strawberries. It's totally fine. Cub can just change the price in their store, and that's that. But wages tend to lag. So that in between time where the price of groceries, let's say, has gone up, but the price of wages has not, the people who are losing out are the people who have wages and need to buy strawberries. Versus if you A, didn't have wages, or a majority of your wealth or income didn't come from wages, or if B, you didn't have to buy strawberries, which in this case is a stand in for food, so most people are going to need to buy that, then you're more fine.
Right.
And
Well,
that's on a proportional basis. So if you're particularly affluent and your groceries are 5% of your take home versus if you're in poverty, it could be 50% of your take home, right? It affects the person on a relative basis
right.
a lot more
A
if it's 50%.
5% inflation increasing grocery costs by 5% is going to be a significantly higher impact on someone who's already struggling to pay the grocery bills
Yeah.
than someone who, yeah, it's a small portion of their income that goes to groceries.
So people who are particularly wealthy with their money, generally speaking, in real estate or the stock market, even if those things don't immediately track, you still have that thing. And as long as you don't sell it, and it tracks even a year out from now, it's irrelevant. And when eating is a relatively high percentage of your income, that's when we start to have problems. So yeah, generally speaking, the people who are making those decisions, which in this case, let's say politicians, groceries are a relatively low, or groceries or need to purchase things are a relatively low percentage of their spend when compared
Most
to
likely,
the
yeah.
average citizen
Yeah.
in the US.
Well, and if you think about like over the past year, inflation was like 5% or something. I don't
Yeah.
know what it actually was. It was something
It's
way
dependent on each
higher
category,
than
but in general, yeah, I think it's
than
somewhere
a
around 5%.
typical, 2 or 3% or whatever. You think standard across the board people are getting 5% raises this year?
No, it's not going to happen.
Right. Like 5% is, and that's just to like maintain basically your current purchasing power.
Yeah, that's not even actually
The
getting a merit increase. Yeah.
right.
And by the way, I think that this is, at least in some ways, further contributing to some of the labor shortages that are being observed. Because essentially, if you were offering $10 per hour to be a burger flipper at McDonald's before, and you're still offering $10 per hour, but anything I'm going to go buy is maybe even in some cases 10% more, right? Like if you think about someone who's flipping burgers at McDonald's, right? Generally, we have people who are maybe in poverty or maybe just getting into the workforce. And I would say, generally speaking, a large percent of the spend for these people is going to be on transportation of some kind, so gas or bus tickets
Essentials.
or
Yeah.
things like that, food. Yeah, we're talking about real essentials here, okay? And these are things that are most definitely going to immediately track with inflation most of the time, and in the case of gas, go up even more than that. So somebody could be literally experiencing an effective inflation rate of 10% for themselves while wages remain completely stagnant.
Mm-hmm.
If all of a sudden you were making 10% less, you very well could say, yeah, screw this. Like, I'll go find something else, or I'll try and figure out something else on my own.